Search Outpost U-309 to any and all Freestar Collective craft. We are under heavy fire. Hostile spacers are overrunning our position on Altair 2. I'm not sure how much longer our outpost can hold on. We don't have much time. Private Mahoney, out.
Between the stars, there is a man crouched inside a derelict ore processor that hasn't moved in 30 years. The hull is cold. The lights run off a jury-rigged fuel cell that someone dragged in from a wrecked shuttle, and it flickers every few minutes in a rhythm that has probably, by now, stopped being annoying and started being the closest thing he has to a heartbeat. He has a weapon. He has very little food. He has no allegiance to any government, no city to return to, no employer waiting on his labor, no contract outstanding, no address registered with any civic database in any inhabited system. He exists outside every system that the settled systems has built to account for human beings. And when you walk past him, when you cross that threshold and his motion sensor pings, he will shoot at you. Not because he is evil, not because he is broken beyond recognition, because in the logic of his world, you are the most dangerous thing he has encountered in weeks. And the first rule of survival is not to wait and see. We kill him. We move on. We collect whatever credits or ammunition his body was carrying, and we continue toward the next objective, the next location marker, the next strand of the story we are actually following. He barely registers. His name, if the game ever gave him one, scrolls past so quickly it might as well not be there. He is an obstacle, a threat, a spacer. But here is the thing that quietly refuses to sit still once you let yourself notice it. The settled systems are enormous. Humanity has colonized dozens of star systems, built cities that stretch toward the sky, established governments that have fought wars over their right to define what civilization looks like. And yet, in every corner of that expansion, in every derelict ship and abandoned mining post and forgotten survey site, there are human beings living outside all of it, not hiding, not waiting to be let back in, not staging a rebellion or organizing toward some political alternative, just outside, existing at the edge of the map the way shadows exist at the edge of a fire, permanently. That word, permanently, is the one worth sitting with for a moment before we go anywhere else. The settled systems will tell you that spacers are what happens when people choose to reject society, that they are criminals and raiders, and the natural product of individuals who were unwilling to contribute, unwilling to integrate, unwilling to do the things that the rest of humanity has managed, somehow, to do. And on the surface, that story holds together reasonably well. Spacers do raid. They do attack without apparent provocation. They are, in the most functional and practical sense, hostile. The evidence for the official account is right there in every derelict they occupy. But a story that begins with "they chose this" almost always turns out to be more complicated than it initially claims. And the question that sits underneath all of it, the one that none of the settled systems governments seem particularly invested in answering, is this: what does it mean that a civilization this large and this old keeps producing people it cannot absorb? To understand where spacers come from, you have to understand what the settled systems actually offered the people who built it. Not the promotional version, not the founding documents, but the lived version, the one that existed at the level where ordinary people made their decisions about where to go and what to do and who to become. The United Colonies, the oldest and most powerful political entity in the human sphere, was formally established in 2159, while Earth was still technically inhabited, and the idea of a human civilization distributed across multiple star systems was still new enough to feel like an achievement rather than a given. New Atlantis followed within 2 years, and within a generation it had become the template for what a human city in space could look like. Organized, hierarchical, architecturally ambitious, and built on a civic model that made belonging explicitly conditional on contribution. Citizenship in the UC is not simply a matter of being born there, or arriving there, or building a life there over decades. It is earned. The UC's governing body, the military, administrative, and scientific triumvirate, known as MAST, offers 3 formal paths to citizenship: military service, administrative contribution, and scientific work. In practice, the military route is the most accessible. Scientific and administrative positions are considerably more competitive, a result of most people being unwilling to risk combat. So, for the majority who pursue citizenship, it means years of your life given over to the UC's armed forces in exchange for the legal and material status of belonging. If you serve, you are a citizen. If you don't, you are a resident, which sounds almost identical, but functions very differently when the machinery of institutional entitlement is applied. Housing eligibility, legal standing, access to certain contracts, and licensing pathways, all of this flows from citizenship, and citizenship flows from service. This is not a hidden policy. The UC is explicit about it, almost proud of it, in the way that institutions tend to be proud of their systems when those systems have been working long enough to seem natural. The logic is presented as civic and intuitive. Society is maintained by those who are willing to defend and invest in it, and those who are unwilling to make that investment are not, in the deepest functional sense, full members of it. It is a coherent position considered entirely from the inside. But coherent positions have edges, and the people who fall off those edges don't simply disappear. They go somewhere. The system doesn't process them. It produces them, and then they have to figure out what comes next. The Freestar Collective, founded in 2189 by Solomon Coe through a voluntary alliance with the Volii system, positioned itself explicitly as an alternative to that kind of conditional belonging. Its founding ideology centered on individual liberty, the right to live and work and build and fail and succeed without institutional interference, without mandatory service, without the overhead of a state apparatus that required anything of you beyond, more or less, not actively harming your neighbors. On paper, this sounds like it solves the problem the UC creates. In practice, it creates a different version of the same problem, rooted in the same overlooked question about what happens at the bottom of the distribution. Liberty as an organizing principle works exceptionally well for people who already have the resources to exercise it. A frontier that promises freedom is a genuinely compelling promise if you have a ship, a marketable skill set, some capital to stake a claim, or connections that can translate into opportunity when you arrive. If you have none of those things, if you arrived at the frontier in debt to a company that fronted your passage, if your labor contract locked your options for years and then expired in a system where the economy had softened, if the partner or community you were traveling with dissolved partway through, the promise of liberty is an abstraction that doesn't warm you, doesn't feed you, and critically, doesn't intervene when the systems around you fail. The Freestar Collective's commitment to non-interference, which is its ideological bedrock, and the thing that makes it feel meaningfully different from the UC, means that it also does not build the safety infrastructure that a more interventionist state might construct. The freedom is real. The consequences of that freedom, for those without resources to exercise it, are equally real. Then there is the third layer of the economy, the one that appears least in political philosophy and most in people's actual lives, the corporate frontier. Neon on Volii Alpha is the most visible example. Originally a fishing platform built by Xenofresh Corporation that reinvented itself as a pleasure city when the native chasm bass fish were found to produce a substance with psychotropic properties. Where Xenofresh led, other megacorporations followed. Rugin Industries eventually built its tower on the opposite end of the platform, and by 2330, Neon has become the largest commercial hub in the settled systems, administered entirely by Xenofresh's Benjamin Bayou. The civic structure is an extension of corporate interest, not civic design, not democratic accountability, but profit and control. But beyond Neon, beyond the named places with established reputations, there are extraction operations on remote moons, survey contracts that send workers to the edge of explored space with equipment that may or may not be adequate, processing facilities on airless rocks where the nearest UC or Freestar presence is a week's travel away, and the only law is the company's internal security protocol. The corporations that operate across the settled systems are not governments and are not subject to the same civic accountability structures, but they move people, enormous numbers of people, across vast distances, and when their operations close or become unprofitable or shift their primary extraction site to a different moon in a different system, the workers they transported don't always have a means of return. Transport is expensive. Contracts don't always include passage home. The planet that once housed a functioning operation becomes, for the workers left behind, the only place they have. The colony war accelerated and sharpened all of this. 2308 to 2311, 3 years of conflict between the United Colonies and the Freestar Collective that ended with the Pyrrhic Freestar victory at the Battle of Cheyenne, and a peace whose terms addressed the immediate political crisis without touching the economic and social conditions that had made war feel necessary. Wars are remarkably efficient instruments of displacement. Soldiers who survive don't always return to something that resembles the home they left. Supply lines collapse, and the workers who sustain them scatter when the contracts funding those lines are canceled. Communities that had organized themselves around military logistics, fueling stations, repair facilities, transport hubs, find the entire economic basis of their existence withdrawn without warning or compensation. The war ended in 2311. The displacement it generated did not end with the signing of any peace. This much seems evident from where spacers are found most reliably, not just in any abandoned structure, but specifically in colony war-era facilities, the decommissioned outposts and processing stations that the conflict left scattered across contested systems like geological evidence of a disaster. The war made a particular kind of ruin, and those ruins became, for some, the only available shelter. None of this is a clean or complete account of how any specific person became a spacer. The game gives us the patterns, the displacement, the abandonment, the war's long tail, rather than the individual stories, and the individual stories have to be inferred from the conditions they left behind. What we can say with confidence is that the path from functioning participation in the settled systems to living in a cold, derelict ore processor is almost always a sequence of smaller, individually survivable failures. A contract not renewed, a ship that broke down in the wrong system with repair costs that outran any available credit, a debt that compounded faster than income could address, a background that flagged incorrectly in a citizenship eligibility review, a community that collapsed when the economic reason for its existence disappeared. No single step is the step. It is a slow walk toward a margin that, once crossed, turns out to have no gate on the other side. Spend enough time moving through the settled systems, not through its cities, but through its spaces, the in-between places where the map thins out, and you develop a sense for what abandonment feels like as an environment. It has a specific and recognizable texture, the corridors of a derelict ship that once ran a crew of 30 carry a particular kind of silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that used to be full. Cargo containers that haven't been moved in decades still bear shipping labels, still have destinations printed in the standardized font of a logistics company that may no longer exist, still carry the implicit promise of a supply chain that was severed so long ago it has been forgotten by the entities that severed it. Mining outposts on airless moons still have rosters posted near the entrance, names and shift assignments, a bureaucracy of productivity that outlasted the operation it organized, marking the presence of people who are now somewhere else or nowhere at all. Survey facilities still have data terminals faithfully recording atmospheric conditions for researchers who stopped requesting the data years before anyone thought to turn the recording function off. Spacers move into these spaces and make them habitable through a specific kind of applied intelligence that the settled systems never recognizes as such, because recognizing it as such would require reconsidering what kind of person a spacer actually is. From what we can observe across the derelicts they occupy, there is a consistent pattern. Power is restored selectively, not enough to make the location visible on a long-range scan, but enough to run a heater and a motion sensor and a medical device if one is available. Choke points are reinforced in ways that the original designers, who were thinking about industrial workflow rather than tactical defense, never anticipated. Storage space become living quarters through the pragmatic efficiency of people working under strict material constraint. The structural vulnerabilities of the building get learned. Which sections still hold atmosphere? Which corridors carry sound differently when someone is walking them? Which maintenance hatches open to an exterior that can serve as an emergency exit? And adapted to with a thoroughness that is objectively impressive. This is skilled work. It requires working knowledge of power systems, atmospheric management, structural engineering, and improvisation under conditions of severe scarcity. And it produces something that, in the most architectural sense of the word, qualifies as a home, a place whose layout has been shaped by the specific people who inhabit it, whose organization reflects their particular dangers and their specific routines and their individual way of being in a world that offers very little room for comfort. But the thing about making your home in something that civilization left behind is that the architecture itself encodes your relationship to that civilization. You are not in a space that was designed with your presence in mind, that was invested in as a place where human beings might flourish, that was built to the specifications of someone who thought about what you might need. You are in the negative space of someone else's decision-making, the gap between what was built and what was maintained, between what was used and what was deemed no longer necessary. The corridor you sleep in was never meant for sleeping. The surface you cook on was never meant to be a kitchen. The motion sensor at the entrance, reprogrammed from its original function as an industrial safety device, is now your perimeter alarm. Everything is repurposed. Nothing was made for this particular life. And that architectural fact carries a meaning that goes beyond inconvenience. The spacer's environment is, in a very material sense, assembled from the residue of decisions that other people made and then walked away from. The ship was retired by a company that determined it was no longer profitable to maintain. The mine was closed when the ore body was exhausted, or when the market price dropped below the point where extraction made financial sense. The survey post was defunded when the system it monitored failed to produce the results that would have justified continued investment. In each of these decisions, someone with the authority to make it determined that this location, and by implication everything in it, was no longer worth keeping, and the spacer inherited the husk. What does it do to a person, specifically, slowly, over time, to live in something that the rest of the world decided was done with? To make your bed in the judgment that this place has no further value? To learn the rhythms and textures of a space that was defined by its abandonment as belonging to the past? These are not questions the settled systems asks itself, because asking them honestly would require tracing the chain of decisions that produced both the abandoned space and the person inhabiting it. It is much simpler and much more comfortable to see the spacer and the derelict as a natural pairing, disorder inhabiting disorder, the unwanted finding the discarded, than to recognize that the same economic logic produced both. The derelict was declared worthless by the same system that declared its inhabitants ineligible. That parallel is not coincidental. It is the same judgment applied twice to two different kinds of thing. The first thing most people experience about spacers is the shooting. This is true, and it would be a mistake to minimize it. Spacers attack on sight in the vast majority of encounters, and that aggression has real consequences. People die. Ships are raided. Outposts are seized and stripped. The violence is not incidental or performative. It is a central feature of what it means to be a spacer in the settled systems, and any honest account of them has to take that seriously rather than explain it away. But taking it seriously means understanding it, not simply labeling it. And understanding it requires spending a moment inside the logic of a person for whom survival is genuinely the organizing principle of daily existence. Imagine building your understanding of the world entirely from the evidence that your situation provides. You exist outside every legal framework in the settled systems. No UC Marshal has jurisdiction over you, but that also means no UC Marshal will respond to a distress signal you send. No Freestar Ranger will hear your complaint if someone takes your supplies. No corporate security will intervene on your behalf if a rival group decides to move into your outpost by force. The enforcement mechanisms that protect ordinary people in the settled systems protect them by virtue of their belonging to one of the systems that commands that enforcement. You do not belong to any of those systems, which means those mechanisms do not extend to you. You are on your own in the most complete and literal sense that phrase can mean. In that world, every arriving stranger is a problem statement. Not because strangers are necessarily hostile. Experience probably tells you that some of them are not. But the cost of being wrong in one direction is an inconvenient interaction. The cost of being wrong in the other direction is death, or having your supplies taken, or having your outpost seized, or any number of outcomes that a person without institutional backup cannot recover from. When survival is the organizing principle and there is no buffer between you and the consequences of miscalculation, the calculus of trust becomes brutally simple. Trust requires a margin of error that you simply do not have. This dynamic has a name in political theory: the security dilemma. When no governing structure can credibly guarantee anyone's safety, and when the consequences of being wrong about another person's intentions are catastrophic, everyone has a structural incentive to arm, to preempt, to establish credibility as a threat before being threatened. The tragic feature of the security dilemma is that every individual acting rationally within it, arming, threatening, preempting, produces a collective outcome that is terrible for everyone and that makes the dilemma worse rather than better. It is a trap that looks from the inside like a series of rational decisions. Spacers are living a security dilemma every day without the vocabulary to name it as such, and without any institutional mechanism that might interrupt it. The aggression is not, one way of reading it, a character flaw that pre-existed their situation. It is, based on what we know of how they operate and where they survive, a learned response to a specific set of conditions, a response that is, from within those conditions, entirely rational. This does not make the violence less dangerous or less harmful. It makes it comprehensible in a way that matters for understanding what the settled systems has actually produced. And this matters especially because the category is self-reinforcing in a way that makes escape from it almost impossible. Once you have been identified as a spacer, once you have been perceived as someone who exists outside the systems of the settled systems, you are treated as a spacer. You are shot at without conversation, hunted without investigation, denied access to services, refused assistance, and being treated as a spacer makes the rational response increasingly indistinguishable from the behavior that produced the identification in the first place. The label closes around you with a completeness that very few labels achieve. There is no appeals process. There is no UC magistrate who will hear your account of how you arrived at this derelict and what brought you here. There is no pathway back to being seen by the systems that surround you as something other than what you are now classified as being. The violence that clears spacers from derelicts and remote outposts is, within the settled system's legal and moral frameworks, uncomplicated. They are not citizens. They are not protected subjects of any governing body. They are not even, in the ordinary sense of political discourse, opponents with standing. They have no rights to negotiate over, no status that requires acknowledgement before it can be suspended. They are spacers, which is a category that has been constructed to sit outside the circle of concern that structures how civilized people think about the legitimacy of harm. This is not a deliberate policy of permanent exclusion. That would require a level of coherent intent that probably doesn't exist in any central planning body. It is something more mundane and more durable, a category that is convenient to maintain because maintaining it requires nothing, and questioning it would require a great deal. The word freedom circulates around spacers in two directions at once, and both directions are telling. From inside the governing logic of the settled systems, the freedom ascribed to spacers is sarcastic. Free to starve. Free to freeze in a broken ship at the edge of an uninhabited system. Freedom understood as the absence of the things that make ordinary life livable. And this is accurate as far as it goes. The freedom of having no institutional claim on you is largely experienced in material terms, as the freedom of having no institutional support for you, and in the conditions where most spacers find themselves, that means slow attrition through accumulated deprivation. But there is another sense of freedom that is also real, and that tends to get buried in the sarcasm, and it is worth examining directly rather than dismissing. Spacers genuinely do not owe anything to any government in the settled systems. They pay no tax to the UC, perform no mandatory service, hold no contract with any corporation that has leverage over their continued existence. They are not subject to any citizenship review, any behavioral code enforced by any institution, any surveillance architecture maintained by any government for the purpose of knowing where they are and what they are doing. The elaborate web of conditionalities that structures the life of even a reasonably well-positioned UC resident, the service requirements and their citizenship implications, the ways that institutional access shapes the choices available to you, the background checks and the documentation requirements, and the bureaucratic systems that determine eligibility for the things that make life workable. None of that applies to someone who has fully exited the settled systems accounting. That is a real form of freedom, not a comfortable one, not a sustainable one for most people, but a real one. And the comparison with the Crimson Fleet makes this distinction considerably sharper and more interesting. The Crimson Fleet occupies a similar position in the legal geography of the settled systems. Outlawed, violent, operating in the margins beyond the reach of ordinary enforcement. But the Crimson Fleet is organized. It has a command structure an internal code, an identity that people join and are then shaped by, the way joining any institution shapes the people inside it. The fleet operates from the Key, a repurposed space station that functions as something genuinely resembling an outlaw city. Hierarchical, political, social, with its own economy and its own status structures and its own version of belonging. Being a member of the Crimson Fleet means being embedded in a community that has expectations of you, and that, in exchange for meeting those expectations, provides you with the resources and collective protection that make the life viable over time. Spacers have none of that. They are, in the most precise and literal sense, individuals, or at most small, situational clusters of individuals sharing a specific location and a specific immediate threat. The game itself confirms this. Spacers have no leadership structure and no central base, operating in independent groups too small and too scattered to constitute anything resembling a faction in the political sense. There is no spacer ideology that someone consciously adopts, no spacer identity that functions as a genuine source of community across the breadth of the settled systems. The Crimson Fleet chose its form of outlawry and built institutions to sustain it. Spacers fell into theirs and have only themselves, or, at most, a handful of others who happen to be in the same derelict when the doors closed. This distinction points towards something uncomfortable about what freedom actually means when it has to exist in a material world that doesn't reorganize itself around your autonomy. The Crimson Fleet's rules and hierarchies are constraining. Belonging to, it means accepting obligations you didn't define. But they are also the source of everything that makes belonging to it worth something. The collective action, the shared resources, the protection, the social life that makes existence more than mere survival. All of it flows from the institutional structure that also constrains the individual. The constraint and the benefit are not separate things. They are the same thing, experienced from two different angles. Spacers, freed from all institutional constraint, are also freed from all institutional benefit. The freedom is total, and it is also, in a very specific sense, the freedom of having nothing to hold on to. This is not a new observation in political philosophy. The tradition has spent centuries distinguishing between freedom from external constraint and freedom toward a life worth living, between the absence of interference and the presence of meaningful possibility. But seeing it embodied in a specific group of people across a specific set of material conditions makes the abstraction concrete in a way that is harder to dismiss. The spacer is not liberated. The spacer is unclaimed. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where the real weight of this life lives. To be liberated implies that you had something to be freed from, and that what you arrived at afterward was worth arriving at. To be unclaimed is simply to be outside the accounting, to have no one whose interests you serve and no one whose obligations extend to you. One of those experiences is freedom. The other is its shadow. What the settled systems does not like to say, what neither the United Colonies nor the Freestar Collective is institutionally motivated to articulate clearly, is that spacers are not a malfunction of the system. They are a product of it. This requires sitting with because it runs against every official narrative about them, and because it has a particular kind of implication that institutions find structurally difficult to accommodate. The UC's citizenship model is built on conditionality because conditionality is how institutions ensure compliance and maintain investment in the social contract. Service in exchange for status is an arrangement with a long history, and from the institution's perspective, it works. It produces a population that has made a concrete investment in the system's continuation, that has a stake in its success. What it does not do, and what it was not designed to do, is account for the people who cannot perform service for reasons of physical health, for people who arrived in UC space with immigration statuses that complicate the citizenship pathway in ways the system was not designed to process elegantly, for the children of long-term residents who were never quite residents and who inherit a reduced standing without having made any choice that would logically produce it, for people whose particular combination of skill and circumstance places them permanently just outside the service pathway's eligibility requirements. The system was not built around the question of what happens to those people. It was built on the assumption that they would find a way to comply or become someone else's problem. The assumption contains the outcome. The Freestar Collective's ideology of individual liberty has a corresponding blind spot, rooted in the same place, but approached from the opposite direction. Liberty, without structured support, works brilliantly for the resourceful and the fortunate, and it produces extraordinary outcomes at its most successful end. Self-made people building genuinely self-determined lives in ways that the UC's bureaucratic weight makes genuinely difficult. It is also fully compatible with grinding poverty at its other end, because the ideology's core commitment to non-interference makes intervention in that poverty feel like a violation of principle rather than a fulfillment of obligation. The freedom to fail is real and protected with the same fervor as the freedom to succeed. The question of what support might exist for those who have failed is one the Freestar Collective's founding philosophy is not well equipped to answer, because answering it would require the kind of institutional apparatus that the collective was, in its founding vision, explicitly defined against. And then there are the corporations. They are the most interesting case because they are the least ideologically coherent about what they are doing. The UC and Freestar both have principled accounts of their own systems, accounts that can be argued with and found wanting, but that at least represent genuine attempts to articulate what kind of society is being built. The corporations operating across the settled systems make no such claim. They move people across star systems in pursuit of extraction. They employ those people under contracts whose terms serve the corporation's interests, and when the extraction is complete or the economic shift, they leave. The workers they leave behind do not appear in any corporate account of operations. They appear nowhere in anyone's account, which is precisely the problem. They become spacers before anyone has processed the category change. Before anyone has decided what they are, they have already become what the system had no place for. And then there is the war. The colony war did not simply kill people, though it killed a great many. It fractured the economic geography of the settled systems along fault lines that the peace treaty, which addressed political territories and military standings, was not designed to repair. Supply chains that had developed over decades were severed by the conflict and never fully restored. Communities built around logistics, around the movement of materiel and personnel across the systems that were contested or adjacent to the conflict, found their entire reason for existence removed when the fighting stopped. Veterans returned to find that home was not where they had left it, that the service which had purchased their citizenship could not purchase the stability that citizenship was supposed to enable. The peace settled the political question. The human cost of the conflict distributed itself across the settled systems and became, in time, indistinguishable from the background noise of frontier life. Every one of these mechanisms, the UC's conditionality, the Freestar's principled non-interference, the corporation's extractive indifference, the war's long displacement, produces what appears to be the same output. People who reach the end of a chain of individually survivable failures and find themselves with nowhere left that will have them. The settled systems doesn't have one mechanism for producing spacers. It has several, operating in parallel, and the inference that is difficult to avoid is that they are features rather than bugs, logical outcomes of systems that were designed around different questions than the ones the displaced people are now asking. Spacers are visible evidence of this. They occupy the physical margins of the settled systems in the same way that they occupy the conceptual margins. They are everywhere you look if you look at the edges, and invisible if you keep your attention on the centers. The violence with which the governing powers respond to them, the ease with which that violence is justified within the legal and moral frameworks of the settled systems, is not incidental to this. It is structurally necessary. If spacers were recognized as a category produced by systemic decisions, then their continued existence would function as a standing indictment, a visible, ongoing record of what the system chose not to fix, what it decided was acceptable as a cost of the way it organized itself. Keeping them outside the circle of civic concern, keeping them named as spacers rather than as displaced workers or failed citizens or the human residue of corporate extraction, means that their existence can be responded to rather than addressed. You clear them out. A new operation moves in. The derelict becomes temporarily productive. And somewhere else, at the far end of another chain of failures, another cluster of people finds themselves in the next abandoned outpost, reprogramming the next industrial motion sensor, keeping the lights on with the next jury-rigged fuel cell. The cycle is stable because the mechanisms producing it are stable. It does not require malice to maintain. It requires only the ordinary inertia of institutions that have never been given a compelling reason to change. At the edge of explored space, beyond the busiest transit corridors and the core systems where UC and Freestar influence thickens into something you can feel in the architecture and the law enforcement presence and the density of functioning infrastructure, there are places where the distance between human settlements is measured in days of travel rather than hours. The frontier, at any given moment, is wherever the last outpost is, and past the last outpost, the galaxy continues, vast and indifferent, full of worlds that no human being has yet walked on, and that may eventually provide the next reason for expansion to move in a particular direction. Humanity keeps moving outward. This impulse is perhaps the one thing the settled systems agrees on across its many fractures. That expansion is good, that new systems mean new resources and new opportunities and new room for the human project to continue its particular form of forward motion. The grav drive, the invention that Dr. Victor Isa arrived at in 2138, made this possible in a way that no previous technology had. The ability to fold space, to step over the distances that would otherwise take generations to traverse, compressed the galaxy into something explorable within a single lifetime. It changed what humanity was capable of imagining about itself and about its future. It is also the technology that continuously produces new frontiers. And frontiers, throughout human history on Earth and now in the stars, have very short institutional memories. The people who move to them are moving toward opportunity, not toward a safety net. The systems that follow, governance, legal frameworks, social infrastructure, the slow bureaucratic machinery that turns a collection of people living somewhere into a community with rights and protections, always lag behind the population that precedes them. They are reactive, not anticipatory. By the time they arrive, there is already a class of people who have been living without them long enough to have adapted to their absence. Those people have developed networks and survival strategies and relationships to power and violence that the arriving institutions will classify as deviance, as criminality, as the behavior of people who have chosen to exist outside society. The lag is not entirely deliberate. Building governance costs resources and requires political will, and the political will to extend institutional protection to frontier populations tends to emerge only when those populations become economically significant enough to make the investment worthwhile. Until that threshold is crossed, the frontier is governed by whatever law people can make for themselves, which is no different, in principle, from the law that governs spacers, survival as the primary and overriding constraint on all decisions. The spacer is, in this light, not a failure at the periphery of civilization, but a persistent feature of what civilization looks like at its growing edge. What you always find in the space between the frontier's advance and the infrastructure that follows it. Every new system humanity enters will produce its own version of this gap. Every planet, or moon, or asteroid field that is designated as a resource opportunity will attract people before it attracts governance. And the people who get left in that gap when the economics shift or the politics change or the operation moves to the next system will need somewhere to go. Some of them will make it back. Some will find transport or a useful skill or a contact who can bridge them back to a context that the settled systems will recognize. And some of them will end up in the derelict or processor, with the flickering fuel cell and the reprogrammed motion sensor, with the cold hull and the very little food and the weapon they've learned not to put down. Not because they chose the worst possible life, but because the alternatives had all, in sequence, closed. The galaxy that the grav drive opened keeps getting wider. The frontier keeps advancing, and the gap between where expansion goes and where infrastructure follows, is always there, always populated by people the governing powers have not yet decided to care about, always generating the next wave of those who have no place left within the systems that were supposed to account for them. This is not a solvable problem in the way that engineering problems are solvable. It is a structural condition of the kind of expansion the settled systems has committed to, which means that as long as the expansion continues in the way it has always continued, the gap will be there, and the people in the gap will be there, and they will have weapons, and they will have motion sensors, and they will shoot first, because in the world they inhabit, that is what survival requires. Return, for a moment, to the man in the derelict ore processor, the one who shot at you, who you moved past, whose name scrolled off the screen before you registered it. We began there because that encounter, repeated, anonymous, instantly forgotten, is where the question actually lives. Not in the political theory, not in the historical account, not in the comparison of UC and Freestar philosophies, though all of those matter and all of them feed into what that encounter is. The question lives in the specific moment of contact between a civilization and the person it could not absorb. In what happens when those two things meet at the threshold of a cold corridor, with a flicker of light between them and a very short window in which a different kind of interaction might have been possible. What that encounter usually means, in practical terms, is that one of you dies. And in the framing that the settled systems provides, the framing of its governments, its legal codes, its cultural assumptions about who counts as a legitimate party in a conflict, that outcome makes immediate and obvious sense. He is a spacer. You are something else. The threat is neutralized. The mission continues. But the question was never whether the outcome makes sense within the existing framing. It was whether the existing framing deserves the confidence we place in it, whether a civilization capable of building New Atlantis and funding Constellation and developing the Grav Drive and fighting a 3-year interstellar war with enough organizational sophistication to determine which side won, whether that civilization, with all of its accumulated capacity, is justified in arriving at an answer to the problem of the displaced and the failed and the structurally excluded that amounts to. We call them spacers, and then we handle them. The word handle is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Handling a problem and solving it are not the same operation. Handling a problem is what you do when the problem is manageable at its current scale, and when the cost of solving it seems higher than the cost of continuing to handle it. Handling the spacer problem means clearing derelicts, interdicting raider ships, maintaining a frontier security posture that keeps the violence from spreading inward toward the systems that matter, toward the cities and the trade routes and the political structures that are worth protecting. It is not inhumane in its own terms, but it is not an answer to the question underneath the problem. It is a response to the symptom that leaves the condition intact and operational and continuously productive. The settled systems has now been organized for over 2 centuries. In that time, it has managed wars and peace treaties and technological revolutions and political realignments of enormous complexity. What it has not managed is a serious institutional reckoning with the category of people it continuously produces and then encounters with weapons drawn. That silence is not accidental, it is structural. Asking the question out loud would require acknowledging what the answer implies about the systems that generated it, and institutions, like people, are rarely in a hurry to indict themselves. The central question has transformed since we first asked it. We asked, what happens when civilization decides someone is no longer worth incorporating? The answer, across the full breadth of what we have examined, is this: they persist, they adapt, they develop, under the pressure of survival, a way of being in the world that the civilization they came from has no framework to process. And then they are perceived as a threat, which justifies the continued failure to incorporate them, which ensures that the conditions generating them remain untouched, which means more of them, always, at every new frontier, in every new derelict, with every flickering fuel cell. And the real question, the one that the settled systems will eventually have to face at some edge of some system it hasn't reached yet, is whether a civilization this capable of expansion is also capable of a different kind of growth. Not outward this time, inward, toward the people it keeps leaving behind, toward the man in the ore processor whose name it never learned, whose history it never asked about, whom it encountered at the end of a long chain of failures that the system had a hand in and walked away from without noticing. That question has not been answered. The settled systems is still deciding whether it wants to. Maybe that is the most revealing thing about it.